All right, round five of Politics and Airplanes, the erosion of safety through economic sanctions. Today we'll be talking a little bit about the war in Ukraine and more importantly, how it has affected the Russian aviation industry and specifically in regards to safety. Talk a little bit about some of the effects that breaking ICAO regulations has had, Russia's cannibalization of aircraft, the effects of the airspace bans, and then we'll take a brief look at Russia's future. Right, so aviation is a global commodity, and it's a great enabler of many things, including trade, tourism, cultural exchange, and obviously the movement of goods and services. On the other hand, aviation and the global economy are also dependent on aviation, and the global economy is and aviation is dependent on the global economy. So if we stop trade, we stop all of the other positive things: tourism, cultural exchange, and moving people around. If, on the other hand, we stop tourism, cultural exchange, then there's no aviation industry. And this is kind of a case of what we're seeing in Russia. By economic sanctions essentially stopping the exchange of goods and services, we're moving towards seeing a collapse of the Russian aviation industry, and the most pronounced immediate effect is the effect on safety. So what happened? So in 2020, Russia kicked off its invasion of the Ukraine, and the West responded, this time with very broad sanctions which targeted key economic sectors. So Russia's been under some sanctions since 2014 and the annexation of Crimea. Those sanctions specifically targeted the oligarchs and the major corporations that were involved in pushing for this annexation. What we're seeing now is more of a nation-level set of sanctions that are really designed to pressure the Federation into stopping their aggression in Ukraine. All right, so this has obviously had some effects on aviation. None of them are very good. Right now, Russia is under some pretty heavy sanctions, similar to the last 3 decades of sanctions on Iran and the North Korean sanctions that have been in place way before I was even thought of. So effectively, there's no parts, there's no maintenance, there's no ability to lease aircraft or even get technical support for them. With Russia being so heavily dependent on Western technology and having such a large territory to cover, even for domestic air travel, this has created some pretty big issues. Russia responded as Russia does. Essentially, when sanctions were handed down and companies were told to repossess their aircraft, Russia essentially said, nope, these are mine now, and seized 515 foreign-owned aircraft, which comprise about 80% of their fleet. So in order to make this move semi-legal, at least domestically, Russia re-registered the aircraft, which meant they were essentially registered in 2 places. That's a big no-no under ICAO and the regulations they have there. So ICAO put them on red flag status. So essentially, red flag status is reserved for any airlines, or in this case, countries, where the safety of air travel can't be guaranteed. The West responded to this red flag status by effectively banning all flights in and out or even through their airspace. Eventually, Turkey and China followed suit. So Russia's effectively geographically isolated when it comes to air travel. The bigger issue with all this is with no aircraft and no support for aging aircraft, they have relatively few choices to keep their domestic travel up. They've turned to gray market parts, so parts of unknown origin, cannibalizing their fleet, including the 515 aircraft they seized, and then attempting to internally manufacture parts. That's probably going to go as well as we think it will. Some of the immediate and long-term consequences by violating ICAO standards by doing these things, right? Gray market parts, fleet cannibalization, and making their own parts, they're effectively voiding their airworthiness certificates. And this is going to create some issues that we'll talk about later. So some analysts say that they've got anywhere between 12 and 24 months before this fleet requires major overhauls that they can't support internally. So there's only so many engines you can steal off another aircraft before they're all timed out. So again, airworthiness will be even further compromised, but more than likely they're going to keep overflying the maintenance times. And obviously when we're overflying maintenance times, we create some big safety hazards. A big part of this has been the loss of revenue, right? So with no international flights in and out, we've lost not only passenger, but also landing fees. And this has led to spending cuts, obviously. And some of the easiest ways to do that are by deferring maintenance, scaling down training, and a whole bunch of other non-safe things to do. So again, the expected consequences here, we expect to see an increase in aviation accidents, not only in their number, but also in their severity. Russia, meanwhile, is taking the everything is fine approach. And the government insists that these sanctions haven't affected safely. But if we look at the numbers, they tell a different story. So since the beginning of 2023, there's been about 120 incidents, so not necessarily accidents, but incidents, and 60 accidents in the last few months of 2023 alone. So we can expect this number to keep going up, right? Using old parts is not going to increase safety in any measurable way. They've attempted, like I said earlier, to mitigate the sanctions by passing legislation to legalize certain things like seizing aircraft, the dual registration issue. They've removed legislatively the restrictions in place requiring them to use certified parts from the FAA or EASA. And then they've also issued developer certificates to Russian companies. Effectively, they are certifying these companies to produce certified parts. The problem is that these certifications aren't recognized anywhere else in the aviation world. So effectively, they're just generating counterfeit parts and counterfeit certificates. Anything that is signed by any of these companies won't be recognized if and when sanctions are lifted. So we're just kind of kicking the can down the road. Another thing that Russia is experimenting with is manufacturing their own aircraft. As a world power, they obviously have technology in place to build aircraft, and it's theoretically possible, but so far it's been nothing but delays, being over budget, and a lack of good parts. So Russia has attempted to complete their MS-21 aircraft with domestically sourced and manufactured parts. This has added almost 6 tons of weight to the aircraft, which their engines can't actually keep up with. So best case scenario, we're going to have some airplanes out there that are incredibly inefficient. And that also, aside from cutting things like fuel consumption, range, and economy, we're also creating situations where flying with underpowered engines is going to be a safety issue, right? So things like going around, which is normally a freebie, will be a little bit more challenging, especially in some of these airports with higher density altitudes or elevations. This isn't the first time that international sanctions have affected the aviation industry of a country. So prior to the 1979 Islamic Revolution, the Iranian airlines ranked in the top 10 for global safety. We've seen a steady decline, and they've been under similar sanctions: no parts, no maintenance, no aircraft, enforced reliance on cannibalized parts. So since 1979, Iran has seen 1,800 fatalities, with the bulk of those occurring between 2000 and 2010. So about 60% of those fatalities happened within the past couple decades. We're not expecting this number to go down, and I think Russia is going to face a similar situation, possibly on a bigger scale, just because of the size difference between the two territories. Like we talked about a little bit earlier, Putin's actions are going to have some pretty long-term consequences. Aside from the negative effects of essentially stealing aircraft from lien holders, so they're not going to be too thrilled if sanctions are lifted and Russia asks for more airplanes. I think there's going to be a little bit more caution there. But also, like we talked about, by using gray market or cannibalized parts, they've essentially voided their airworthiness certificates, and Russian airworthiness certificates are not going to be accepted internationally. So there's going to be a big issue there if the sanctions ever do get lifted. On the other side, we've also seen step backwards into the era of Soviet control. So Aeroflot, Russia's biggest airline, is now over 70% state-owned, which means that Russia's FAA is essentially overseeing its own airline, and there's quite a lot of motivation there to sign off on things that would otherwise not be acceptable. They've also slid back into their default mode of state secrecy, which, as we've seen in the past with incidents like Chernobyl, has not exactly worked out well for them. On the other side of the coin, what are the ethical responsibilities of the fellow citizens of the world, right? So the West, in this case, does have some responsibility in ensuring that there's peace and stepping in and helping Ukraine. However, we do need to do that in a way that minimizes the consequences on civilians. So the average Russian is not responsible for the invasion of Ukraine. It's government policy. And while the sanctions that are put on the government are working towards pressuring them into a more peaceful state, we can't overlook the fact that it's the civilians that rely on air travel that are being most directly affected. So this guy, Robert Mann, he's an airline consultant and analyst, and he came up with this really great quote that I really like. Aviation is an enabler of economic growth, both domestically and internationally. Without it, you take it back to almost an agrarian society trying to operate with the railroad network. Essentially, that's what's happening in Russia. So as air travel becomes increasingly unreliable, they're going to have to default back to the way they used to do things, which is by rail. Thankfully, they do have a pretty extensive, I wouldn't call it robust or safe or even pleasant to travel on, but they do have an extensive railroad network that will allow people to get to most places. But trips that usually take a few hours by air are now going to wind up taking days or weeks. And as that railroad network becomes increasingly burdened with the increased responsibility, right, of getting good services and people, without any money, they're not going to be able to keep it up. The fact that everything is so far and remote means that we're going to see not only a decrease in aviation safety, but in the overall safety of travel for the average Joe. All right, so last slide is about balancing global politics and morality. So I took a quote from Luke here, but love your enemies, do good to them, and lend to them without expecting anything back. In the global sense, loving your enemy means making sure that we not only ensure peace to the extent possible, but we have to make sure that these effects aren't going to essentially collapse a nation. And more importantly, aren't going to detrimentally affect the citizens. Like I said before, right, the average Russian isn't the one writing national policy, yet they're the ones that are most affected. The if or when question is more of a when question. So in the next couple years, we will see a major Russian air catastrophe, and Putin will blame the West. The big question is, how much responsibility will the West take for issuing the sanctions in the first place, right? So where is the balance between ensuring that we stop the aggression in Ukraine without completely destroying an entire people? So that's kind of something to think about. But that's the end of my presentation. Thanks for watching. I hope it wasn't too boring. I know economics aren't everybody's favorite thing, but I think this really is important because it does have a major effect on aviation safety. If you can't get parts and you can't fix your planes, you can't get people anywhere safely. Thank you.